Good afternoon. This is Rebecca Martin. I am as many of you know, the Executive Director of NASH, and I'd like to welcome you to what has now become our ongoing series on the system response to COVID-19. Many of you were here with us a few weeks ago when we started out with a general discussion about the issues, and we today are going to be focusing on remote instruction, which we know is a priority for you. So let me move to the next slide and tell you that we have put up we are working on a crisis clearinghouse with the System Center at the University of Albany, folks that you met last time and we'll see again today, Jason Lane, Nancy Zimpher, and Maria Kahn. We are developing resources for you to share with a place for you to share with one another, with documents, policies, blog posts, and the opportunity to assess and reflect on the variation of the strategies that are working in your environments. So you can look for some information coming out from us on our listserv once that's ready, which should be in the next week or so. And if you go to the next slide, I will tell you that we have put up a resource page on the NASH website. We have a few blogs here now. We also have information on the upcoming webinars. We will next week have a webinar that the systems heads have requested, a conversation among just system heads on the role of the system in rebuilding the economy. And then we'll come back into this larger format open to everyone, including all of you, on April 30th with a webinar on another topic of high importance, which are what are the financial implications for all of our systems moving forward in this environment. And so with that, what I would like to do now is turn this over to Jason Lane, who is going to moderate this discussion today. Jason?
Great. Thank you, Rebecca, and welcome everybody. We're delighted to have all of you with us today for this important and very relevant conversation. As some of you recall, a few weeks ago, we asked systems to respond to a survey about what was important to them, and we just wanted to review a little bit of that data. But obviously, one of the most important things that came up in that was the transitioning to remote and online education. Now, we're beyond the transitioning point. For most, we're well into this space and beginning to think about what the future holds, but we thought it was important to have a conversation about where we are today and moving forward. Next slide. Within that, some of the specific work that people were looking for were, the support for services for students, support services for professional staff, support services for faculty. Probably most important was simply this issue of access to technology, and obviously that plays into issues of equity and the digital divide that we're facing today. And so we're really going to try to dig into some of those topics when we move to the session. Next slide, Maria. Each of these systems, as have many of you, have developed websites designed to support their campuses and their faculty in moving into remote education. These are screenshots from the 3 sites from our panelists today, Wisconsin, Maryland, and SUNY. Maria is going to be posting the web addresses for these sites into the chat box. What I'd like to do also is invite you, if your systems have developed resources, to upload those web addresses to the chat box as well. We will capture them and put them all into a document that we'll share with this group afterwards so that we can make sure that we're collecting and sharing all that information together. So I'd like to introduce the panel now, 3 individuals who have deep experience in instruction and online learning and now remote education. MJ Bishop from the University System of Maryland. MJ, you want to put your hand up there? There we go. Carleen Vandezande from the University of Wisconsin System. There's Carleen. And Kim Scalzo from the State University of New York. So we've had a set of questions that we're going to start with, and again, this is really intended to be a conversation more than a presentation. And what we'd like to do is start with some questions that I prepared for them, and we'll ask them. But as you have questions that pop up, feel free to put those into the chat box, and we're going to do our best to make sure that we can respond directly to the questions that you raise as well. But to get us going, What I'd like to do is just ask each of them in a sentence or two to share what's top of mind with them now that we are a few weeks into this experience. So, Kim, maybe I'll pick on you first.
Classic, forgot to unmute. Thank you, Jason. It's great to see everybody and be part of this webinar. So, now that we have gotten the majority of our courses transitioned to remote instruction, our focus has turned to things like the digital divide, devices and internet access for our students who don't have them. We recently had a conversation on assessment strategies in this remote instruction mode as we approach the end of the semester. And then also we have some folks who are now talking already about what's happening in the summer and what the fall might bring. So those are the things I would put out there.
Great, and we can get into all those in a little bit. Carlene?
Sure. Mine come in the form of questions, and that's how are students, faculty, and staff academic, social, emotional needs being met as this continues? So the humane side. The other thing that we are thinking about at our system office is how do we best support the faculty and staff as they transition from what we call emergency conversion to purposeful instructional design, both now, summer, and positioning into fall.
All right, perfect. MJ?
Yeah, I would plus one on that, Carlene. I think the primary thing on my mind right now is how do we make this pivot into at the very least summer and possibly into the fall? And how do we demonstrate the concrete ways in which we are going to get better at this so that we can point to them and market the heck out of it? Because I think it's going to be important for retention and for making sure that students come back.
So great segue into the next question, which was trying to make sense of all these various labels that are going around right now. They're sort of the gut reaction is you refer to it as online learning because that's what we refer to this generally as in the day-to-day work. But the reality is, and you all as experts know, that it's not the typical way that we think about online learning. And so we do remote learning, we do crisis education. Carlene, you had another name that you just threw out there. How do you make sense of those three names or the various terms that we're using right now? What is the difference of now versus what we would traditionally think about online learning? But I think more importantly, and sort of as you have framed this, what's the pivot look like? As we move forward, how do we move from what we're doing right now in this sort of crisis response to where we need to be in the future? And maybe I'll go reverse order. MJ, start with you.
Sure, thanks, Jason, for this question, because I think it's really important. I guess my English major background makes me really believe that in the value of terms that we use and the ways in which we're using them. We've been referring to this as emergency remote teaching. And the difference for me between that and online education or online learning is really almost entirely wrapped up in planning and instructional design. When we do online education well, we have the opportunity to think in advance about the things that the online environment affords and doesn't afford for learning. It affords an awful lot of things in terms of being, we can develop asynchronous materials, we can create things that make it, learning more accessible, but there are also things that it doesn't do well in terms of, personal connections and a lot of the social emotional learning aspects that we know. And it feels distant, can feel very distant to some learners. When we're doing this well and have the opportunity to plan in advance, we build those things into the environment. We think in advance about who are our learners, what are their needs going to be, how do we ensure that those materials are there, how are we making sure that we're doing plenty of formative assessment along the way in order to guarantee that those learners can be successful. We moved in the middle of a semester from what was face-to-face teaching and an environment in which faculty are able to do that because they can see the look on their students' faces, they can talk to students, they can engage with them on a day in and day out basis. We moved from that to suddenly doing all of this from a distance. And it's probably, unfortunately, as we all know, the worst case scenario in terms of actually developing a high quality online learning environment.
Great, thank you. Carlene?
I see the distinctions across 6 different criteria for me, and it's where each of those different types of instruction fits on like a continuum. For example, the degree of student support, and is all student support accessible? for our students. So a well-crafted online course is going to have all of those considerations, but maybe this emergency pivoting that we had to do, emergency conversion, that's what I called it, may not have as robust of a student support network that we want. Another piece MJ talked about would be the instructional design and the intensity of the design. And across all three types of instruction that we're seeing right now, that level of student engagement varies significantly. A focus on academic integrity issues. When we first had to put something up quickly, we might not have had the proctoring in mind. How are we going to do that? So eventually questions about proctoring and the verification of student identity came up as well. The level and type of faculty and staff development is pretty intense for a well-honed online program and set of courses where we did the basic just to get them there by next Monday kind of professional development in some cases. So the degree of faculty and instructional development. Access considerations, well thought out access considerations for more robust online instruction. You're going to have those discussions ahead of time. In a lot of cases, we didn't have time for that. Even looking at like the northern part of Wisconsin where broadband already it is magnifying the equity issues that we have and still have there. And then as a professor of curriculum theory, I have to say that the coherence and the alignment of the curriculum. We go back to our roots, right?
Right.
It's very intentional, I think, for very, very intentional for a well-honed online program or course. But again, just getting people to make that pivot, things are a little choppy. So we're on that continuum of coherence and alignment that really goes along with learning theory are things.
Perfect. Great. Kim?
Thanks. So I think one of the ways that we talked about the distinction at SUNY with our campuses is I really liked what MJ said about the planning and instructional design. And this remote instruction is really about providing academic continuity, ensuring that students can complete the semester in the best way that we can enable them to do that. And, you know, I think that a couple of things that we've tried to pay attention to, one early on and one that we're coming to later, which is really about engagement. How do you know that students are actually participating? Did they actually show up when classes restarted? You know, when we intentionally design an online course, we have lots of mechanisms built into the course to facilitate, promote, enable engagement. And in this remote instruction, that was, you know, what are the kind of rudimentary ways that we can do that that are just very basic? So engagement was a piece of it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, now we're coming to assessment as we approach end of the semester and the normal ways that faculty are used to doing assessment, which can be done very well in the online course if you have time to plan and design that in. Now we're trying to help faculty figure out how do they do that in this remote instruction way. And so that's another difference that I think I would point out.
So as we think about where you've been and where we're going, and I appreciate you all making those distinctions because I think they're absolutely critical, both now and as we move forward. You know, what have your systems done to support faculty in moving this direction? But I think almost more importantly, I'll pick up the word I think MJ used, which is pivot. As we pivot toward the future, a number of systems have already said summer is going to be fully online. Increasingly, there is wonderings about what fall will look like and how soon people will be back on campus. So no doubt some are beginning to think about the continuation of what we're doing, even possibly into the fall. So, what have you done to date? But then how are you thinking about that pivot to the future as we begin to plan toward what will likely be at least some continuation of online learning, remote education into the near to medium range futures? Anybody want to go first?
I'll go.
Go for it, Carlene.
Okay, I think that what we've done so far and what we're planning on doing in the future as a system are going to be about the same. We want to lean on the infrastructure that we already have in place to support online learning. And that would be, we have an arm of our system called the Extended Campus. That's system-wide. That's an office that offers support for existing online collaborative program. The president of the system quickly engaged that office to say, okay, you provide this now, let's leverage what you've got and let's get that out, let's disseminate that out across the system. We have a well-developed network of teaching and learning centers. So we engaged those folks on the campuses to start collaborating, and they already are collaborating with instructional designers and distance learning environment offices on their campuses to start offering more and pushing out more faculty development. We have a system distance learning experience office, so they collaborated all over the place as well and started measuring things and getting resources out. So leaning on the supports that you have at the system office, our UW Help, which is a student-facing office. It's a virtual office, where students apply to our different universities and get resources. They put up a fantastic set of student resources, so student-facing resources. We're using tools that we've invested in as a system, for example, the EAB Navigate program. All of our institutions have that, and that program allowed us to do campaigns out to all of our system beyond advising, but to get resources out there for students. And then our UW System Shared Services, which is an office that has shared HR, procurement, and IT. And the IT segment of that office reached out to make sure that our different universities had enough laptops for students, had enough hotspots, and started working with the local universities to look at partnerships with internet providers to make sure that everybody had the resources that they needed. So I think that those same offices are going to be engaged as we scale this up and as this is prolonged.
Great advice. So really sort of like focusing on what do we have already in place, where have we made those investments and how do we leverage them?
And moving forward as a system, and I think that this is where systemness really, really was powerful in this crisis. And I'm happy to say that.
Great. I'll quote you on it. MJ or Kim?
Kim, you want to go next? I think it's
Sure,
your
I'll go.
turn.
Yep, thanks. So similarly, I think, we really have a strong team at the system office to draw from that has a lot of these types of services and supports in place. So I represent the online learning support at the system level, which we're now under the umbrella of SUNY Online. We have a university-wide Center for Professional Development, and we have a pretty significant OER services initiative. So we brought together the supports and resources from those organizations to very quickly stand up this website that Jason shared that includes, it's kind of an aggregator of resources and services and information for 3 different audiences. And the audiences are campus leaders, faculty and staff, and students. So, and there's remote instruction pieces of all of that. So what we were able to do in very short order was put together a series of webinars and training under what we called the Remote Teaching Clinic. We also stood up 2 new services, one for faculty called the drop-in sessions, and that's really 100 hours a week of instructional designers being available in a Zoom session just like this, where faculty who suddenly found themselves in this remote teaching mode could pop into the Zoom session and say, I used to do this in my face-to-face class, how do I do it online? So we did that for faculty. We also did that for students. We also, in many of the webinars that we did in the remote teaching clinic, we drew on faculty across the system who had experience teaching online. And they led several of those webinars. We did technical training webinars. We also did a variety of other topics like working from home, working remotely. How do you deal with that? And then finally, we most recently have stood up a series of discipline-specific communities of practice in our SUNY-wide workplace platform. So faculty in similar disciplines can come together and talk about, for example, in the sciences, how are you doing labs? How is that working? And folks who have done that already could share some of their best practices. And so we're starting to see more engagement now in those communities of practice. So I'm really, really happy and proud to be able to say that we were able to stand up a lot of things very quickly for our campuses. And we really saw our role in support to the campuses and helping them with capacity and capability, because when you think about the scale that we had to go from and to in a very short amount of time, I think this is a place where systemness, I'll use that word again, really was very helpful. And we've heard that from the campuses.
If you look toward the future in that space, what do you begin to think about now, sort of as that pivot forward toward that next iteration?
Yeah, so I think, those of you who know SUNY know that we have been trying to, for several years now, expand what we're doing in online learning. And I think what's been really tremendous is to see the faculty that have been kind of forced into this, who maybe said, I never would do this, and to see the supports and the resources that are available, and to see kind of where is the need, where do faculty need help the most in getting there, I think has been really illuminating for us. So I think that there's an opportunity. So for example, these drop-in services, right, that we just kind of thought, there's going to be so many faculty who just, have never been put in this position and now they have to do it. They might just need to talk to someone. They might just need to be able to drop into a session and ask a question. Well, that's something that we may look to continue in the future to help, in terms of scale, because we can do that. So I think that's one of the opportunities that we see, but we really see more faculty kind of opening their mind. I know you have another question later, which we'll might get to this, but that's been really one of the wins for us. And one thing I think we can capitalize on.
Great. MJ?
So we've done many of the same things that Carlene has done, and some of the things that Kim has done, but we haven't had quite the army of infrastructure in place to make some of those kinds of things happen. Our focus has been on supporting the supporters. So the Kirwan Center that I direct, my people are the Teaching and Learning Center directors, the folks in the provost's offices, vice provosts who are charged with academic innovation work and so forth. So we've been meeting with them at least once a week, if not more. And in fact, we've actually expanded the group to include instructional designers and instructional technology, academic technology folks, and so forth. But we've been running a series of what we're calling topical discussions, not unlike what we're doing here, in which we're having conversations around things like, how do you engage faculty in conversations around redesigning assessments, Kim, and looking at those differently so that you don't have to worry about proctoring at the end of the semester, and in fact, can still ensure academic integrity and rigor, but without having to have, surveillance-based proctoring for every single student. We're having conversations around, how do you help faculty with these folks? How do you help faculty balance student privacy with accessibility, which are turning out to be somewhat competing priorities here, where by, on the one hand, for student privacy, we're being told not to record, and on the other hand, that doesn't serve accessibility needs very well. So, going back to our OAG, looking for guidance on those kinds of things, disseminating that back to the campuses so that they can speak authoritatively. We're doing a lot now also, Kim, plus one on the need now for us to do some formative assessment. How did things go and what can we do to improve moving forward? And we're starting to coordinate those efforts across the system institutions. One of the conversations I'm now having with, we had it at one of the provost meetings, and now I'm having it with my group, is whether we're online or face-to-face in the fall, we need to start working with faculty on building in some form of a diagnostic assessment at the beginning of the fall semester. We have students that we can still help through, this somewhat sketchy experience that they had this spring. If MJ's moving from Chem 1 in the spring to Chem 2 in the fall, we should find out what MJ didn't learn in Chem 1 and be ready to redesign and accommodate some remediation of those skills in the fall semester. I really think that's on us. And interestingly, this conversation actually began with a conversation about, which I'm sure many of you have been having as well, the system decided we would accept pass-fail grades from the community colleges as transfer. And it began with, well, how do we know that they've learned enough? And I said, well, how do we know that our own students have learned enough in order to be successful in the subsequent courses? This is just good instructional design. We should be doing this anyway. So again, getting back to what are we thinking about now? regardless of where we are, as I said before, online face-to-face, I think this is going to be an important first step at the beginning of the fall semester. And I think our faculty need to understand how to do this in a way that doesn't make it a high stakes exam. I'm not talking about not letting MJ into the Chem 2 course. I'm talking about understanding where she is at the beginning of the fall semester relative to her knowledge, her prerequisite knowledge for the course.
Great. So thank you all for that. And appreciate all of the wisdom you provided, sort of how we've moved in this direction. But there's no doubt that you've encountered some challenges along the way. And so
It was easy.
It's been easy, right? If you could reflect for a minute on perhaps what, maybe one or two of the biggest challenges have been, and I particularly want to highlight issues of sort of equity and access in that conversation as well. And to the extent that you have, how might you have overcome those challenges, or are you, working to overcome those challenges?
In Wisconsin, we definitely had access challenges with Wi-Fi, internet, and that would be because of some of the geographic separation that we have across our universities. And it just brought up to the surface and magnified the equity challenges that are there for students that are in some of our communities as well. So in order to work on that problem, we were able to expand Wi-Fi and to make hotspots. I don't know how they did that, but that happened so that there were more parking lots, like students could drive to different places, and we even had some faculty have to do that, to drive to different places. So expanding Wi-Fi and hotspots. We also engage in some partnerships with internet providers, and they are providing access to students and their families for free during this time. And I think that's good community partnerships. We also, through our shared services, as I mentioned before, we're able to students and hotspot devices. And we also, through the advancement offices, have donations coming in from our partners in the community, alumni, wherever donations come from. So people have been very generous to get students things that they need as well. And I think focusing on our request to our state legislature to increase funding for higher education, and in particular to ease those access issues. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point on the emergency funding piece of this, because there's so much even beyond just the technology that has to be addressed for our students. As somebody has said, you've got to get through Maslow's hierarchy of needs before you can get to Bloom's taxonomy of learning.
Right.
For so many of our students, right, they're just dealing with Maslow right now and safety and security.
Yeah.
All of this.
And there's some horrible stories about students going home. We have one of our institutions tell the story about one of their students going back to New York City and discovering his mother dead in the apartment. There's just a lot of that kind of thing that our students are living with right now that is just horrible. I'll again, plus one on what Carlene just said. We've been doing many of the same things and have had many of the same concerns and doing the same kinds of things to overcome them. But I'll twist it a little bit. I actually had the opportunity, and I was thrilled to have it, to speak to the Faculty Senate, system-wide Faculty Senate meeting yesterday. And one of the folks on the call asked me about large section courses. We're talking about equity for students, and now, I think we're also going to need to begin starting to think about equity for faculty. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but at least for our UMGC, now it used to be UMUC, our best practices around online instruction is to try to cap courses at around 30 students or so. I mean, we don't do online at scale except for the MOOCs and things that we've been experimenting with. Now we're looking at faculty that have sections of 100, 150 students, and we're asking them to teach remotely this semester. This is a big issue that hadn't even occurred to me until yesterday when this faculty member raised it. You all may have already been giving it some thought, but there's something that we're going to need to think about with respect to if we are going into the fall semester, what we're going to do about that. And then also, I think to some degree, at least, everybody, promotion and tenure and those kinds of things that I think are also on everybody's minds with respect to faculty equity for this semester.
Yeah. No, I think those are really great points. And even if we're back on campus, can you even have large lectures which is the other side.
Right,
Right.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
In terms of
So,
social distancing.
and, you know, that brings up budget issues, right? We can't divide that section into 3 or 4 and, you know, afford to fund the adjuncts.
Right. Kim?
So I'll just echo the, you know, kind of digital divide issues, as we call them, of, you know, access to both technology and internet. And, you know, I think in addition to the working with internet service providers, our state has also kind of trying to take on this issue of getting internet to every New Yorker. That's not going to happen overnight, but it has, you know, and that's been on the agenda here for a while, but I think it's getting some increased attention, which is great. 2 other things I'll mention that we're doing, because we are so geographically dispersed as a system across the state, is, and we have students maybe on Long Island who are enrolled at SUNY Oswego, that maybe they can get to, you know, a campus on Long Island. So we're looking at Eduroam across the system, which we
Yeah,
do not now
we
have
want
in
to.
place, which
Yeah.
would give everybody the same sign-on regardless of what campus or which campus facility you could get to. So
Mm.
that's something that is already underway, which I'm excited about. The other thing we did is a laptop loaner program. So we were able to procure 10,000 laptops and I think 3,000 Chromebooks, which we've been distributing through our CIOs to campuses for students who just really all they have is a smartphone. So now they have a device where they could actually, you know, log on and join a class, where before they were trying to do it from their phone. So I think those are 2, in addition to what everyone else is saying, 2 things that we have been able to do that I think are helping.
So thinking about a different way then, we often focus on challenges, but what have been some of the more pleasant surprises as you have worked through this experience?
I think Carlene hit on a couple of these earlier. You know, we're starting to hear faculty asking some of the right kinds of questions. You know, this is way too much content for me to cover in an online course. How do I pare it down to the things that really matter? How do I make sure I've got the curricular coherence and alignment to the objectives? How do I redesign my assessment in order to make sure that it's rigorous, but at the same time fair and you know, that I can guarantee integrity behind it? You know, I think we're starting to hear faculty ask questions about, you know, hey, this worked, so what else could I try? You know, there are pockets of it. I mean, there's also an awful lot, I think, of things that aren't going so well. But, you know, these are the silver linings, I think, in all of this, that frankly, for my work, it's like, yes, we're here. We've been talking about this for years. I'm so glad you're now listening to me. You know, so suddenly everybody knows what an instructional designer does. That's great. I wish we had more of them, a lot more of them.
I think for me, our system is moving forward together in ways that the system itself may not have moved forward together. Sometimes I think that we are a federation, right? There's separate, but then we move together. We have some things in common, but I've really noticed that in the discussions with the chancellors and the provosts, people coming together around the critical issues and trying to resolve how do we move together as a system. And to me, that has been, it shouldn't be a surprise, but it's been pleasant as well. And also the innovative things that people are doing. For example, coffee with the chancellor virtually. People in offices, I mean, how many times does a student get to talk to the chancellor, right? Or how many times does faculty really have access to the chancellor and have the give and take? I bet it looks like this, but yeah, lots of heads, you know, but yeah, using the technology to make those connections, connect with the provost. So those are, I think, wonderful things that are happening.
That's great.
So I'll just echo that and say, you know, SUNY is, we aren't always known for communicating well, but I have to say in response to COVID-19, we are communicating incredibly well. And I see that from where I sit at the system office, and our campuses see that as well. So, you know, the chancellor's meeting daily with the presidents. We have weekly meetings with the provost and the academic leaders across the campuses. We meet with the directors of online learning and the instructional design community. The registrars are meeting weekly, and there are just many of those groups of folks that are meeting regularly. So we have mechanisms for communicating to them what we're getting at the system office, and at the system office we're communicating well. So I've been really excited about that, because when you know what's happening and you have actual data and facts and information to share out, you can be really helpful. And I think we've all felt like we know what's happening, and we can be there to support the campuses to do the work that they have to do, and they're feeling it too. The other thing that I would say that has been a really nice surprise have been those faculty, what I would say, who have kind of taken risks, who are really so committed to teaching that and doing what's right for their students, that even though they've never done this before, they're kind of jumping in. And we had a webinar last week with our academic program lead community across the system, and some of the faculty came forward and talked about what their experiences had been from not ever teaching in any way using technology, to kind of what their process was and how they got there, and how, kind of excited they were about being able to see their students like this in a Zoom session or in a Collaborate session, and to know that their students were okay and that they could actually do this. That was just, so rewarding. And so I think that's been one of the really positive things.
So a heads up to everybody, I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to turn to you guys, so you can begin thinking about what questions you might want to ask. Either put them in the chat box, or we're a small enough group here that we can open it up and dialogue with each other. So I'm going to take a pivot on this last question I was going to ask you guys, because you've talked already a lot about what we've learned. But in the last answer, you've all talked a bit about sort of systemness and that system perspective on the work that you're engaging in. And so I wonder, what are you learning about the work of systems in this, and how we can collaborate across campuses to create the changes that need to happen to support our students and our staff, and how might we carry that forward into the future?
I think we're learning together as a system how to pivot. And that was a word that I wrote down, and MJ, we're so on a wavelength, MJ. The planning to pivot, what does that look like, and how do we pivot together? So I'm learning that systems oftentimes can orchestrate something so that they can move together. It may be slow, but there are times when they need to move in concert. I also think that as a system, we can have competition among our campuses, because several of the universities might offer the same programs or things like that. I've seen that fade somewhat as we are learning together how to pivot and respond and serve our students and keep serving our community. So that's something I'm observing, Jason and Nancy, and I want to try to take that apart as I continue to observe, and I'm journaling. I'm journaling about this, sitting at a system office and watching this and that and that and that. So maybe to be determined, but how a system orchestrates it to work is fascinating now in a crisis.
And I'm wondering too, as you were answering that, Carlene, because I wasn't sure what my response was exactly. I think we've been lucky in Maryland. We are also a very federated system, but we've had leaders that have brought the senior leaders at the institutions together for some time. I mean, we do meet weekly, not weekly, monthly with the provosts and the presidents, and, bring these folks together and have these conversations. But I was wondering, as you were talking about whether one of the things that we'll come away with is a little more centralization than we've had in the past, a realization that all of this could have happened a lot more quickly if we were on the same LMS, or it could have happened a lot more quickly if we had, other things that were easier for us to throw a switch on and make happen, and trust each other a little more that if we do that, it's going to be okay. System's not going to be watching over everybody's shoulders, and that we can have some of that centralization in order to be able to respond and be a bit more agile in these kinds of situations without it having to be big bad system. One thing though, you know, that I'm feeling like just in terms of the general answer to what are we learning from this crisis, you know, this whole notion that higher education can't change quickly, that's a load of baloney. I'm sorry, we've just demonstrated we can. So no more excuses as far as I'm concerned around academic innovation. We can do this, we can do it fast, we can do it if we choose to. And, you know, I'd hate for us to have to continue to have crises like this in order to get the job done, but I sure hope that that's something that we take away from this.
Yeah. I think what I would add to that is, you know, I think that the roles between system and campus, you know, we've been talking about that a lot, right? What can we do at the system level that is really value add and helps campuses and isn't so much anymore viewed as we're trying to control or take over, but when we work together and when we are engaged and when we play kind of the role that we can play at the system level, it actually helps campuses and allows them to focus on the things that they really need to do. And I think that's been really, you know, interesting to observe the appreciation at the campus level for the work that we've been doing at the system level. That is not always the case, right?
Yeah.
But I've heard more thank yous and we couldn't have done this without you. And the services that you've provided have been really helpful. And, you know, that I think will serve us well as we go into this next phase of, you know, whatever the, you know, fall is going to look like. And as we think about, I love what you just said, MJ, about, you know, don't tell us that higher ed can't change quickly because we just did it. And it's been amazing to see all of what has happened in a short time period, and, you know, to the you know, credit of all of the people in our system. So just like incredibly humbling for me to be a part of that.
And we all were in it together. It just wasn't one segment of our system. It just wasn't one segment of a campus. It was the totality. That, I think, is the profound piece. If we all look at what our purpose is and do that pivot together, that's the collective impact, Jason, I think, or it's got potential for it.
Well, and that's the only way we're ever going to change the higher ed business model anyway, right? So how do we continue to keep that collective work happening? You know, the CFOs, the innovation people, the academic affairs people all need to be working much more collaboratively, and did so during this crisis. How do we continue that conversation?
So let me open it up to others now. If you have questions for the group. So a lot of people unmute, so who wants to jump in?
Come downstairs with me. Come on, kiddos. Come downstairs and talk.
I think we unmuted everybody.
Anybody have a question? I'll ask another one then while we're waiting, unless somebody has one.
Kim,
A couple who unmuted there.
Jonathan Hull from University System of Georgia.
Yep.
Hey, Kim, sort of listening to what y'all did versus sort of the way Maryland was and Wisconsin sort of operated. I guess I have a question about how systemy is it where you are? Like how is your governance? How tight is your governance in terms of the ability, y'all's ability to direct and mandate and control, and how much of it is a cajole?
Yeah, I think you're muted, Kim.
I'm muted, yeah. So, you know, I will just jump on the term federation. I think SUNY often is thought of as, you know, confederation of 64 campuses. And, you know, I think we have under the current and our previous Chancellor Zinfer, who is on the line here, have really thought more about what the value is of us functioning as a system. But I think we have very strong faculty governance and shared governance throughout the system. And there is a fair bit of campuses doing their own thing. So, you know, technology solutions are distinct from campus to campus. Academic programs, of course, are distinct, but I think we do a fairly good job at what we call shared services, as I know many of you do. So we provide a fair bit of services at the system level already for online learning. So we have instructional design support, we have student support, we have technology infrastructure, we do professional development, we support communities of practice. So a lot of that already was in place, and we were able to kind of bring that to bear. All of that, most of it today is available on an opt-in basis, but we have more than half of the campuses opting in to all of those services that I just described to you.
And Jonathan, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, we don't do as much around shared services. We just don't have the budget for it. But I'm actually already thinking about things like, you know, taking our, in fact, somebody on the call yesterday again made this suggestion, doing a matching program with some of our faculty at UMGC who could support cross-disciplinary, you know, faculty at other institutions, you know, the chemistry faculty are trying to figure out how to do their labs online and all those kinds of things. So, you know, I think we can replicate some of this without some of the infrastructure they have at SUNY, just by, like you said, Kim, opt-in opportunities. You know, hey, if you're interested in volunteering for this, you know, and you want to come and listen to this person talk or be part of a professional community practice, you can do that. We're also looking at, if I can get the budget for it, thinking about contracting with an iDesign, instructional design firm, to provide some of these buckets of service hours, so to speak, like you're doing, Kim, because I think that would be tremendously helpful to expand the bench on our campuses. You know, we'd still funnel the requests for support through the institution, but then they would kind of do the triage and say, okay, call 1-800-iDesign, however it's going to be set up, and you can access the answers to your questions there. So I think there are ways to make it happen even without the infrastructure that Kim's lucky to have. We just have to figure out creative ways to do it.
And what I'll say about that is the majority of the services we provide at the system level, aside from OER, which is all funded by the state,
Yes.
are really funded by campus fees. So campuses buy in to our LMS help desk and to our student support services. They, instead of kind of doing it on their own, they buy into our services, and we're able to provide it at the system level for less cost per campus than if they had to do it on their own. Mm-hmm. So that's another option.
Love that.
Other questions? Well, I'll pose another question then. We talked about the crisis, and MJ, you picked up on this, that we moved very, very quickly in a short period of time. But I think unlike any other crisis that we have experienced, at least recently, whereas you might have a fire on the campus, right, or a flood, or
hurricane,
another horrific event, a hurricane hits, it happens, it's over, and you move on, right? And you try to figure out, you know, we're much, you know, more in a marathon of a crisis where it's not clear where the end is on site. And, you know, I think it's beginning to weigh more and more on people just in general of being stuck at home. And I think the level of effort that people are working, you know, some folks 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, particularly in the early days of this thing, trying to navigate the crisis. You know, thoughts on just in general, how you're navigating this sort of personally as we think about the duration of this, or how do we support our faculty? Because I think they also are really beginning to be, as we look at the end of the semester even, right, the sort of the oh my, how do I do finals, I think is sort of creating another mental stressor on them now that they've got everything online, but there's a whole other issue there. And then, you know, what if we come back in the fall and we're back in the space again? So just, you know, any thoughts or reflections on sort of the mental piece of this as people are trying to manage a crisis that at the moment doesn't have an end?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this. I'll say I spend my days, like I'm sure many of you do, in these webinars, you know, meetings, presentations, you know, communication channels, right? Your ears, you know, however you're participating. Thank God my laptop has good audio. So, but, and at the end of the day, you're kind of exhausted, right? Because you're just on all the time for all day. But I will also say I have never felt more connected to people, both at the system office and across our system on the campuses. than I have as a result of all of this. More people who are in Zoom sessions are sharing their video, and we're connecting, as people, as humans. People have their dogs and their kids showing up, and, we kind of relate to each other that way. I'm sure some of you, have experienced virtual happy hours. Those things are happening because out of necessity. And, I hope for me, and I think some of our faculty are feeling this as well, that it doesn't go back, to where it was, that we remember all the ways in which we can connect with each other and support each other and be there for each other. We had somebody on a webinar come into the webinar and tell us that her father passed away that morning. And, she was in New York, he was in Florida. There was nothing for her to do because she couldn't go, she couldn't be there, right? So just connecting like this in a human way, I think is really good.
You're muted, Carlene. Still muted.
There we go.
There you are.
Better?
Yep.
Okay. Some of our conversations in Wisconsin have been about the recovery. So we've really tried to invite multiple voices into that reimagining our future. And I think that that's a healthy thing. Taking stock of the lessons that we're learning right now, taking stock of what the challenges that we still need to work toward, and doing that scenario planning. And I think it's important to have faculty, staff involved in that. Our student government right now isn't meeting, and that is a concern because we want them to weigh in on any policy flexibilities that we need to identify at this time. So I would just say two things: the planning, reimagining the future, or recovery, rebuilding what we need to have. The other thing I wanted to say, and no one's talked about it that much, but this is where I live a lot, is building flexibility into the policies that we're creating, and yet leveraging flexibility in policies that we already have. A lot of times people think that policy is just a hard stop. But I think a good policy also has, I'm not going to call it an escape clause, but I'm going to say the elastic clause, right? Is there something in there that would allow a university to have an exception for what we're doing? I see Kim said you had flexibility in policy as well.
We've been, our chancellor, our relatively new chancellor, he started in January, is an MD, by the way, so, very fortuitous on that. Jay Perman, he talks a lot about being nice. He talks a lot about, and it was actually even before this was really, I think it was sort of on the radar, but the very, very first meeting that he had with us in the system office, there were two things he said: high expectations, and I want you all to be nice. And, it was interesting to hear him say that. I thought, wow, I don't know that I've ever heard a senior leader say that, but it is translated into so many of the things you were just talking about, Kim, and you as well, Carlene, just in terms of being flexible, being empathetic, understanding what people are going through, and recognizing that whatever felt so important to me a few minutes ago really isn't all that important in your world. And so, how do we come to terms with that? And how do I gauge what is important, as a faculty member, whatever it might be, with respect to our students, and realize that so many of the things that we have in place are fairly arbitrary. Deadlines, the ways in which we grade, the difference between an A, B, and a C. These are all things that we just sort of more or less say, okay, that's an A, that's a B. Well, under these circumstances, when students are going through what they're going through, we may need to rethink some of these kinds of things and recognize, if we're being nice, that, some of these things aren't necessarily as black and white as we thought they were.
I think that is a great point, and perhaps a great point to end on. We're coming to the end of our hour. It's gone by very, very quickly, but I know how busy everybody is, so I want to be respectful of your times. I hope you all will, at least at distance, join me in thanking Kim, MJ, and Carlene for sharing their time and their wisdom with us today.
This was
We
fun.
can
You don't have
continue
to
this
thank us.
conversation on the NASH listserv that has been set up. So if you have more questions about remote learning, feel free to sort of send those in, and we'll put those out on the listserv, and we'll share them with our 3 panelists and everybody else as well. If you weren't able to upload a link to your site, please email Nash as well with that information so that we can collate that together, and we'll reshare that sometime next week with everybody. But until we see you on the next webinar, we wish you all well and stay healthy and take care of yourselves. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Jason.
You all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.